Hello ladies and gentlemen, Top Hat Gaming Man here. As usual, ready to take an in-depth look into console hardware history. This time last year on the channel, I dug up everything I could on a traditional Konami game console that was set for release around 1995. Sadly though, this system was never to be, and was completely cancelled as soon as the company came to the realization that they would never be able to compete with the Sony PlayStation, a system that at the time was the most popular ever made, even superseding Nintendo's efforts. But prior to this interesting arc in gaming history, what if I told you there was, in fact, another Konami console, but this time one that actually did see a release? There are so many obscure pieces of hardware that are out there today, which remain somewhat underrepresented on YouTube, and this platform is certainly one of those cases. With this in mind, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the lost history of the Konami Picno. Yeah. It is the beginning of a decade, and now we're at the dawn of the 90s. The Japanese video game scene is continuing to heat up. Back in the mid-80s, Nintendo had begun to dominate in the region, and it was only a few years later that their conquest for supremacy would leak out worldwide. By 1990, a three-way dance was taking place in Japan as three Goliaths, the Super Famicom, the Sega Mega Drive, and the PC Engine were all fighting it out in a war for a spot underneath consumers' televisions. This was a time period where everybody still wanted to challenge for a piece of the pie, and it would not be long until a range of 32-bit systems were popping up as well, all trying to take Nintendo's crown. Whilst the home console hardware market was a lucrative one, it was quickly becoming clear that this was not a place suitable for all companies to be competed in, as demonstrated by the glut of consoles that went up against the Famicom and failed in the previous decade. On the whole, Konami seemed to certainly be one of the smarter gaming companies within this time frame, and although thought about and heavily considered, never directly competed with Nintendo in the home console market. Instead, they would continue to focus heavily on developing and publishing games, which would mean throughout this time frame they would be a third-party publisher for the Super Famicom, Mega Drive and PC Engine, as well as continuing to develop and release arcade games around the world. Konami were doing well. With all of this said though, we know that the company had console ambitions, and nearly released a traditional console of their own in 1995, which, as mentioned, I have already covered in depth. Today, instead, we are focusing on a piece of hardware known as the Konami Picno, that saw release in Japan in 1992. Whilst this gadget, in all technicalities, is a game console, the company never made any attempt to compete with Nintendo, as instead of targeting traditional gamers with their device, the Konami Picno was an early example of a system produced specifically for educational purposes. The system was designed aiming to target a very young audience. This made a lot of sense at the time, as this was a demographic who were too young for most of the software that was available on Japan's big three home console platforms of the period. The Picno was very different to any system available in Japan at its time of release. The device was somewhat of a hybrid between an educational console and a tablet which users could write on. The hardware connected up to a television like any home console of the time, and had a colour palette consisting of 160 different colours. The system also offered composite straight out of the box. This console had a range of educational software released on the cartridge format for the system. Games on the Picno were experienced mainly using a stylus on the system's touchpad. However, additional buttons were also available, such as the two large buttons placed either side of the pad. A range of buttons are also placed along the top of the device, in a similar way to what you would find with a toolbar in Microsoft Paint. The system's lifespan ended up being a short one, with only 23 different titles being released in total. Most of these titles had a very heavy emphasis on drawing and writing, but would also cover other educational areas, such as spelling, reading, counting, and even animation. The platform would reportedly cost 29,800 yen at launch, which is about $270 US. If you take inflation into account, this would mean that the Picno would launch at $500, which is pretty pricey for a system that only featured educational titles. With this said though, Japan and many of its surrounding countries are culturally a lot more obsessed with education than the majority of nations located in the West. The Tiger Mum stereotype is very real indeed, which would not come as a shock if you have noticed that the countries from this area continue to top academic league tables in terms of school achievement. So, the thought track behind a purely educational console for Japan was a very practical one. Now, if you know your gaming history, or even if you have followed this channel for a while, you can probably guess exactly what would happen next in terms of how the Konami Picno would be derailed and prevented from becoming a sales hit. Basically, the idea of an educational console was such a good one that Konami were not the only company out there who had set about producing such a system. Just 1 year later, in 1993, fellow arcade giant and major competitor in the traditional console field, Sega, decided to enter the fray. Sega would release the Sega Pico, another console aimed to target the 3 to 7 year old demographic, a niche previously that only Konami were gunning for. The Sega Pico was more impressive and stylized than the Picno in every way. The system would come in the shape of a laptop, and when the user opened it up, the tablet stylus touchpad would be located on the inside of the device. The system cartridges were perfectly bespoke for young children too. These carts were referred to as storyware and would take the form of picture books with a cartridge slot located on the bottom of them. Whilst the Picno's small game library consisted of a few games that used anime licenses, the Pico's library offered even further appeal. Apart from featuring a range of games of their own featuring anime licenses, the system also featured games that featured Disney licenses, such as The Lion King and Winnie the Pooh, and even its own huge Sega licensed games, such as Echo the Dolphin and Sonic the Hedgehog. Should have said Echo really, that will annoy people. In one final effort to compete with Sega, Konami would release a revised model of their hardware, known as the Konami Picno 2 in 1993, the same year the Sega Pico was launched. The Picno 2 offered little to no improvements over the original model, and offered nothing new really aside from a few cosmetic changes. This unit was released though at half of the price of the original, but this was still nearly as expensive as the Sega Pico anyway. The unit's competition that simply offered a lot more bells and whistles to young consumers. All in all, the unit was outmatched and outperformed in every way by Sega's new piece of hardware, a device that would go on to be a smash hit in Japan. Something that may come as a surprise to you though who are new to this channel is that it is of note that the Sega Pico even outsold the Sega Mega Drive in Japan. That is how lucrative the 3 to 7 year old market can be in the country. Going back to the Konami Picno itself, we have to take into account that the original model of the hardware would launch nearly a full year before Sega's educational system, meaning the Japanese company had time to take inspiration from the Picno and cherry pick exactly what would work for the device and what wouldn't. The influence the Picno had on the Pico is clear to see, as both consoles focused on educational titles based around a touch-based stylus. In educational consoles cases, I guess Sega does what Konami does, but just does it better and makes a lot more money as a result. People do all say the best ideas are stolen, and the Sega Pico's success is testament to this fact. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the lost history of the Konami Picno, a console that very few people ever mention today, despite being released by one of the most famous companies in all of gaming history. Let me know what you thought of today's video, and let me know in the comment section if there are any bizarre systems you would like to hear me cover the history of next. If you are new here, then please consider subscribing to my channel and hitting the notification bell for videos on odd hardware every week. I also have a huge backlog of videos for you to go back and enjoy on the subject. Finally, my channel is partially funded by the generous donations I receive via Patreon. Patrons can earn a credit and a shout out at the end of these videos. These people make working full time on YouTube just a little bit easier, so I would like to thank you all very much for that. So huge shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, JD Robbins, Sint Spacies, Andrew Bazansky, Asobi Kwang DX, Michael Baker, Tom Elliott, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Daniel Daly, RetroReversing.com, House of the Ted, Dan Barlow Jr., Joel, and all of my other patrons. Yeah.